New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the phenomenon of levitation, and in particular, the life of the flying friar, St. Joseph of Copertino. My guest, Michael Grosso, is a philosopher. He is the author of The Man Who Could Fly, St. Joseph of Copertino, and the Mystery of Levitation. In addition, he has written a commentary called The Wings of Ecstasy on Dominico Bernini's Vita of St. Joseph of Copertino, originally written in 1722. His other books include The Final Choice, Death or Transcendence, Experiencing the Next World Now, Frontiers of the Soul, The Millennium Myth, Love and Death at the End of Time, Soulmaking, Uncommon Paths to Self-Understanding, and Soulmaker, True Stories from the Far Side of the Psyche. In addition, he's a co-editor of a very important anthology called Irreducible Mind, Toward a Psychology for the 21st Century. This interview is being conducted via the internet, so now I'll switch over to the Skype video. Welcome, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you. And the subject of levitation in particular, St. Joseph of Copertino is fascinating. It opens up so many doors into the physics of levitation or the parapsychology of religious experience. You've been really exploring his life history for a long time now, for I think a few years.
A couple of years, yes, I would say. And I knew about him, and I had read about him. So I'm not the first one to announce the fact that this guy could do these things. But I wanted to get deeply into it, and that's what I've done.
It seems to be amongst all of the cases of Catholic saints and all the miracles that they are alleged to have performed, this case stands out because, first of all, it's relatively recent, attested to by hundreds of witnesses, and he became beatified after an extensive review by the church itself.
That's right. And it took a while because at first they were a little put off by the strangeness and extremeness of the levitations, in particular the fact that Joseph had a tendency to levitate backwards. And that seemed so odd and distressing to people who were witnessing him. Mm-hmm. But then he explained that the backward levitations were a sign of honoring something that was so amazing that he was just humbled. Mm-hmm. And he backed away, and showing, therefore, that just the thought of backing away enabled the process, inexplicable as it is, to take place.
I'm not aware of any other instance in the list of saints of the Catholic Church of so many levitations over so many years.
I think you're right. I mean, there's at least 150 other Catholic saints, according to Herbert Thurston, who's an expert on this, where you have decent evidence, eyewitness testimony. But the same author points out that nobody comes close to Joseph. And I want to state right up front, it was not only the levitations that he was famous for, but a whole bunch of other paranormal phenomena. And in particular, perhaps the key to the whole story was his amazing disposition to be ecstatic, and which is a kind of radical going out of your body, so to speak. But those two, when you read about mystics, you often hear that some were highly evolved in terms of their, let's say, expanded states of consciousness, their mystical states, the ecstatic openness to reality. And then you sometimes hear stories of saints who had one or two bouts of paranormal phenomena. Joseph is the only one that I know of who was preeminent in both fields, the mystical modes of consciousness and what we call the paranormal, what the church called charisms or gifts, and or the Hindus call siddhis, special powers, you see, but the same idea is present. So this is one reason why I was especially attracted to Joseph, that he seemed to be extraordinarily evolved in both regions of consciousness interest to scholars of today, the mystical and the paranormal.
Levitation strikes me as a very, very rare phenomenon. I've never witnessed levitation in my lifetime, and I've witnessed many other forms of psi. So what does your study suggest to you? How common is this?
Well, as I said, among the saints, many reports of levitation, and there's a huge visual record of levitation among Tibetan Buddhists. And there's a book by Glenn Mullen, which is enthralling because it's got just pages of going back to the 17th century, fascinating artwork that illustrates all kinds of levitations. Unfortunately, we don't have that many eyewitness testimonies, but nevertheless, it's in the tradition. The other thing I would say is that levitation of the body is one thing, but levitation of objects, of tables, for example, that we see in mediumship, we see various manifestations, what we would call levitation among poltergeists. And also, there's an extensive literature, that one that we tend to avoid because it's kind of creepy, stuff about possession. If you read Brian Levac's amazing book, The Devil Within, History of Possession in the Christian West, although he's not looking at all, as I am, and as you might be curious about these phenomena, he admits that among the possessed in the massive work that he had done, there are many, many reasons to doubt the reality of levitation, but he could not. He concluded that he had to say that there were so many reports of possessed people that behaved in strange aerial ways that he had to admit that it was part of the whole syndrome. So actually, there's quite a bit more going on in the realm of levitation. And then there are, in my case, I had several experiences, and one in particular, which convinced me of the reality of levitation, in which, I mentioned this in the book, a colleague and I, in a team-taught class on human development, did various things such as meditating and chanting together. And one of the students recommended we try a levitation experiment. Based on a kid's game called Light as a Feather, that apparently lots and lots of people, when you start talking to them about it, they will remember that when they were kids, they did this. I knew nothing of it. So instead, I suggested, all right, let's do it right now in our class. And I didn't expect any results. I did not expect the results, but I picked the heaviest guy in the class, a 200-pound ex-Marine, and I got 4 of the frailest looking young women in the class, and all they did was touch him, just touch him. They didn't cup him in any way. They merely touched him at each girl underneath the knee and underneath the elbow, And we did a little chanting together. And then I said, lift. I'll be darned. He went up into the air. And I repeatedly say, I will never forget the look of utter astonishment on the face of this young man as he went up in the air. And then very gently, it only lasted a few seconds, down he came. There was another professor in the room that witnessed it, and an entire class of about 35 people. So I call that levitation. It's levitation with contact. But there is no way they could have lifted that guy the way I was watching them. I saw what they did. There was no effort whatsoever. Up he went. And I've done other experiments with groups of people involving levitation of tables several times. Striking examples of where the table took off. I had to chase after it to keep my hands on it. So I came to the project with a sense of confidence, also having read into the literature. But so it is not quite as vanishingly rare as one might think, but it is, on the whole, rare. I've also run into accounts of people who've written me. One guy told me that he fell off a boat, and he was with several other people. In the falling, he suddenly felt himself slow up. And the witnesses on the boat noticed that somehow the gravitation just stopped for a few seconds, gave him enough time to grab him and save him. I've had several stories like that. So under crises, currently, there can be these strange suspensions of gravity that are occasionally reported. Not quite as dramatic as Joseph sailing up 31 feet into the air to take hold of a painting of the Madonna, but still interesting stuff.
And I seem to recall now that Joseph sometimes would remain in the air for a period of time.
That's right. He didn't only just go up. And I would say my readings, the total, readings of what I've made out, he frequently stayed for like 15 minutes at a time, on occasions hours. Those are rare. And by the way, other reports of other Catholic saints also talk about prolonged periods of elevation. And Lambertini, who did the study, who became the Pope,
Benedict.
The Pope, yes, Benedict XIV, he uses the expression prolonged flights. And this was a particular investigator who was highly rationalistic. And that's why it took so long to get Joseph beatified, because there was the strangeness, not because they doubted the reality of the phenomena, but because it was too weird to really make sense of and fit into the traditional patterns of levitation.
I understand that Lambertini, who became Pope Benedict XIV, really made quite a few contributions to the scientific study of phenomenon of this type.
He did, and some of that material is hard to get your hands on, but he was emphatically looking for naturalistic explanations. However, where I would disagree with Lambertini, he thought that pure levitation, without any, gimmicks attached to it, had to be supernatural. I don't believe that. I believe that these effects, these anti-gravitational effects, are part of a process that we just don't understand. And there are some, guesses that we can begin to make to hopefully explain them. But at least to the person who's witnessing the experience, and to a pious person within a religious belief system, they will certainly seem as though only a divine being caused this to happen. But I myself don't accept that interpretation. But I'm nonetheless deeply impressed by the phenomenon.
That levitation is natural, not supernatural.
Yes, but unknown. I mean, just as I don't think not too many of us believe that ESP in general is an automatic indicator of the supernatural. but rather it is a facet of our natural endowments that we don't fully understand yet.
Mm-hmm.
It is consistent, of course, with religious beliefs because it seems that it's an extra-physical agency or force that's doing the trick.
Well, levitation is so unusual that skeptics often feel entitled just to dismiss it out of hand. And I know you've had that experience yourself with one reviewer of your book.
Yes, I did. I've had about, so far, 5 or 6 very good reviews, and not one of them has even raised the question of the authenticity. But Joe Nickell, as we know, he's a so-called critic, skeptic, and I deny the beautiful Greek word skeptic to apply to him, because a skeptic is someone who suspends judgment and inquires. A skeptic is not a disbeliever. And someone called attention to the fact that this gentleman wrote a review of my book. I dug it up, and there was no review. All he did was use one ad hominem comment and say the entire period of time was superstitious. He used that word twice. And basically then tried to come up with a fantastic idea that Joseph was a covert gymnast who had trained himself to jump in the air and hang on things and do all kinds of marvelous things that would gave the impression of being levitation. In short, that he was basically a liar and a scam. And the only trouble with that, and he also made this ridiculous claim in this non-review, that how he got his muscles so strong was by praying hours on end to the point where his knees would get welts on them. Now, I'd like to know, how does that figure? You don't build up your muscles by standing on your knees and praying. On the contrary, that would have the opposite effect. It wouldn't develop anything. So it's complete nonsense. He also hinted that he may have had springboards and used devices that are used by clowns in the Middle Ages to jump around. It's a really pathetic indication of what somebody will attempt to do to deny something that he doesn't believe is true. And it's so utterly ridiculous. Well, the first person to tell me about this review was a friend of mine. He's a professor of religious studies at Princeton University. And it was a joke. When he told me the story, we both broke out into laughter. It was hilarious because that attempt to explain it away is so utterly devoid of value. So, by the way, I wrote a little critique of this response, and I sent it to the author, and I sent it to the journal, The Skeptical Inquirer, and I said, I hope you'll give me a chance to reply to your criticism of my book. And of course, I was being sarcastic because I know that they wouldn't. And sure enough, no response from either of them. There is no response.
With regard to Joseph, I think it's important to look at what kind of a person he was. I understand, for example, he wasn't particularly well educated.
No, I should say something about his life and his times, because it's hard to take him out of the world that he was living in 17th century Europe during the Reformation. It was a period of tremendous conflict, a period of psychic dissociation in so many different senses. I mean, there was the breakdown, the scientific revolution is taking place, the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics was taking place, and there were economic matters. If you look into the history, people were, rather like today in some respects, under tremendous economic pressures. So the whole fabric of 17th century society in Europe, and particularly in Italy, was undergoing all kinds of disturbing changes. So this was reflected in Joseph's life and his family. He was quite literally born in a stable, or a stable is the only translation, stala. The reason is his father was on the lam from debt collectors. His mother, who was a rather dour, very religious but unsympathetic woman, was forced to give birth to Joseph in a stable. She had no protection, so they were homeless, impoverished, and very early on, from the age 7 to 11, Joseph became bedridden with a sickness that for 5 years left him in acute pain, and it was like a gangrenous tumor that grew. And so I think that was an important part of his beginnings as a shaman, mystic saint, because as we all know, at least some of us, very often unusual things happen when people get sick, as they do when people have near-death experiences, a more dramatic illustration of getting sick. And my guess is that while Joseph was bedridden for those 5 years and impoverished and abused, almost abused by his mother, that the only thing he had going for him was prayer and meditation. And it turns out that he had a knack for that. And he had a knack for getting deeply engrossed in his prayers, so engrossed that his mouth would open and he'd look like an idiot. And some of the kids who got to know him and observe him nicknamed him Boca Aperta, which means gaping mouth. And from that came the impression, and even in the literature, that somehow Joseph started out as mentally retarded. That's incorrect. He was not the reader type or the intellectual type. He was definitely what we would call a right brain sort of person. But what would happen is any sound of music or anything that suggested the sacred would cause him to slip into an altered state of consciousness. And so the whole beginning of his life, and when he finally got healed, and no one knows how, by the way, mysteriously the disease just went away, he tried to earn a living, first as a shoemaker. And he was a failure, a complete failure. He just was so distracted, he was unable to concentrate on anything. And he even managed to get into into one convent for about 8 months. And he was a complete failure there because he would drop things, spill things. When he would listen to the music, he would go off into his ecstatic states and he was like untouchable or unreachable. So they concluded that he was a complete moron and utterly unfit for the church, and they just kicked him out. So it was only his mean-spirited mother who stuck to him and eventually got him into a Franciscan order. And he became a priest. This is a very interesting part of the story. You know, in order to become a priest, he had to know something about the church, about doctrine, he had to know some Latin. He was hopeless in those areas. So there were 2 tests that he had to take. And in both tests, coincidentally, interpreted by Joseph as a miraculous intervention of Mother Mary, but from the outside point of view, it looks like coincidentally, he made it through as a priest. In the first coincidence, he was asked to comment on the one passage that he knew something about, that had something to do with the Madonna. And her immaculate nature or something, I forget exactly. But he was asked that, and he was able to speak rather intelligibly about it. On the second, which would have been the harder test for him to pass, when it came to him about to be tested, the gentleman, the priest, the superior who was doing the test said, "Look, everyone so far on this list has done superlatively well. I don't see any point in keeping the rest of you guys waiting. You're all passed." And Joseph did not have to face that test, and he was automatically made into a priest, and he automatically assumed that the Madonna was responsible for that lucky break that he had. So that it wasn't a coincidence, it was an intervention. Who knows? But that's how he suddenly became a priest. So that's pretty much the little beginnings of his background. The moment he became a priest, it was as though he had license then to do the things that a religious is supposed to do. And he fasted and he lacerated himself and he began to levitate after he became a priest. Ecstasy he had before. Now the ecstasies evolved into levitations. And it might be worth mentioning that the first time he did levitate, which was in Brotella, sort of near his hometown, he was contemplating a painting of the Madonna and the Child. So that image was one of the most powerful. He became deeply attached to that image, and when he was forced to leave 16 years later, he actually missed the painting because it was like a love token for him, you know. So anyway, that's just a rough account of his beginnings and how he became a priest and how he gradually evolved.
Now, my understanding is that he was so devout and, as you mentioned, lacerated himself to the point where he developed infections. And I understand it seems paradoxical because on the one hand, I've heard he smelled awful because of these infections. And on the other hand, people reported he had a sweet smell because he was such a holy person.
Right. Well, you know, I've never actually heard that they smelled his wounds, but they may very well have done so. That when they left, of course, that was the end of that. But as far as the alleged or reported odor of sanctity, as it's called, there's a chapter in the biography of Joseph's life by Bernini, which reviews case after case of vivid, totally convincing examples, illustrations of people from all walks of life saying that anything that Joseph touched of theirs would retain these mysterious, really transcendent fragrances that they couldn't even place them. They even had benefits on their mental state and their physical state. And that these effects would last, but not just for days or hours, but sometimes for months and even years. Allegedly, his room, after he left it, kept that smell or kept aspects of it, kept those divine fragrances for several years after he left. So I often thought about that, a guy who never probably took showers or changed his underwear. He must have, you know, been awful even to himself, but there was no sign of that. And his body and anything he touched seemed to irradiate a fragrance. And that, to my mind, is almost as puzzling as levitation. I mean, it's the ex nihilo creation of an odor, which is normally odors have physical basis. And so that's another one of the strange facets of Joseph's paranormal abilities.
Well, I gather he became quite famous in his own lifetime, almost like a rock star, for his saintly phenomena.
Yeah, he did, as a matter of fact. And I often thought of writing a little paper on him as a very early victim of fame. That's a kind of a trope of modern times. And many famous people, their lives can be destroyed by too much fame. And Joseph, not only did he levitate, but he was a healer. And he could read people's minds at a rate that seemed almost constant. But he was also famously holy. I mean, he wasn't just a miracle worker. He was an honest to God, authentic, saintly dude. And so people were interested. They wanted to get advice from him. And some of the people who came for his advice were very distinguished people. One guy would end up the King of Poland, John Waza was his name. And in fact, Joseph told him that you should not, as you want to, become a monk. I want you to go back because you're going to become the king of Poland, and you'll be able to do more good as the king than otherwise, you see. The Duke of Brunswick, who was Leibniz, is the famous German philosopher's employer, came to visit. He was a Lutheran. And he heard about Joseph, and boy, did he get blasted by his encounter with Joseph. When he went to visit Joseph in a secret room and watched him say Mass, Joseph suddenly got very upset. He says, I can't break the Eucharistic wafer. There's somebody in this room that's not a believer. And he gets all violently upset. And then suddenly he confronts the Duke, and maybe I want to be sure about being accurate here. What I know that before he confronts the Duke, he levitates. Joseph levitates, and here's a case of him levitating backwards, again to get off or away from something that was distressing him. So yes, the fame, and that's just a very interesting story in itself. In the end, he came back, the Duke, the following day, and had long conversations with him. It wasn't just, I would like to say this, it wasn't just that people observed Joseph do amazing things, and they said, all right, he can levitate, no one else can do that, he's got to be worth believing in. It was his ideas as well, and his spiritual impact on people. The phenomena, particularly the levitations, were an embarrassment to Joseph, and he prayed constantly, as other saints allegedly prayed for them to stop, but he was unable to. And which makes me really wonder about Joseph, that there was something about him that was unique, that it was an involuntary process. But as a result of this, yes, he became famous, and an effect of that fame was that for the rest of his life, his superiors in the church kept moving him from one place to another because it would get too crowded. The minute they would hear that he moved to another town, then people would be coming out from all directions and coming to visit. And there are interesting stories that, it was good for the economy, because wherever he was, they started building little hotels for people. And they started selling things. So the same thing happened at Lourdes, by the way. But Lourdes stayed in one place. Joseph kept moving around. So he was so famous that eventually the church had to make him incognito. And they had to issue rules saying that no one can visit him. No one can talk to him. He can't talk to anybody. He can't send letters out, which is a pity, because it would have been interesting if he had written he did write some of his ideas down. But so in the last phase of his life, where he ended up in Osimo, which is right by the Adriatic, and I've been there, by the way, it's right at the tip of Italy. And at that time, it was just no man's land. And but even there, try as they may to keep him hidden in a tiny little hole of a room, which he called his forest paradise. I don't think you and I would call it a forest paradise the way they describe it. There wasn't even any light half of the year coming in. But he was perfectly happy there. But people came anyway. And they would sometimes, earlier in his career, some of the different towns, they would climb on top of the churches, pull the slates down, hammer holes through the church so that they could watch and witness his phenomena and witness him. So yes, his fame, in a sense, made his life a whole lot more difficult. Yeah.
It sounds as if the church fathers were actually somewhat embarrassed by him.
They were embarrassed by him, but one of the things that happened was that early on in his career, one religious functionary wrote a letter to the Inquisition and said that there's this guy, he's walking around in all these towns and he's acting like a messiah. Didn't accuse him of faking levitations, accused him of having a suspicious attitude toward his own phenomena. That's all you had to do. So he was called from where he was in Copertino to Naples to stand before and explain himself to the Inquisition. And when he got there, he convinced everybody that, look, I'm embarrassed. I don't want to do this. I can't help it. These flights. And so they questioned him. Are you proud of yourself when you have these experiences? What does it make you feel like? All these interesting questions designed not to question the reality of the Levitations, but to question the nature of his response and his attitude. They were looking to see, was he arrogant? Was he going to use this stuff as a way of starting his own little movement? Remember, the church is struggling at this time to maintain its integrity and its doctrines. It's got enemies on all sides. There's the science, there's the economic problems. There are the Protestants that want to undermine the church. So what do they do with this strange guy who's both an attraction and could be very dangerous? So yes, his popularity in the final analysis actually served to increase the plausibility of his phenomenon, because wherever he went, the same thing happened. And in some places, he only lasted in a place called Pietra Rubia for 3 months, because he was so on the supernormal ball, so to speak. Things were happening so rapidly, so often. So many people wanted to catch him out. They broke down parts of the church to watch him, that they had to move him out in three months. And then he lasted only 3 years in the next place, a place called Fossombrone. Never heard of that, right? These are all very obscure little towns in northern Italy. And then the last time that they got rid of him, moved him around, was in Osimo. And the day he stepped into Osimo, he said, here's where I'm going to die. And I should say this, another feature of Joseph's paranormal abilities. He knew his life backwards and forwards. The older he got, he just simply knew more in advance. He predicted things. He knew exactly when and where he was going to die. And so anyway, that's the response to your question about his fame. In a way, it caused him to become more famous. Mm-hmm. Because, when you're moving a guy around, that makes him more interesting.
Well, and I gather the church was really scrutinizing him very carefully, because they were concerned about being embarrassed in the event that he was some kind of a phony, either a spiritual phony or some sort of a magician faking phenomena. There were others at that time, I gather, who were faking stigmatas and the like. That's right. There were. But I have to say, I don't know of a single instance where anyone suggested that Joseph was faking his miracles. They were only concerned, as you rightly said, with his attitude. And so he went a second time later on. He had to go to Rome, and that was the second visit to visit with the inquisitors. And at that particular time, he acquitted himself, and then he was told to say mass at a church of Liguria, it was known as, and a bunch of nuns and a bunch of inquisitors went to that mass and watched him levitate. So there's no question about the fact that this guy was doing these strange phenomena. But yes, they were surveilling him to the very end. But at the same time, there were people that were critical of that they thought the church dealt with him rather harshly. And you can see that in Bernini's biography, who's independent and very critical of the church for being so harsh with. This biography by Bernini he's the son of the famous sculptor.
Yes, indeed, sculptor and painter, and of course he's the guy that designed a good part of the cathedral in Rome. He was an architect as well. A very interesting, one of the great artists of that period, or of any period, in my opinion. And Bernini himself was, this was his last book, I believe, that he wrote. And it's just one of the things about Bernini that I will say that I really appreciate. He was aware there was something in the air of the new emphasis on evidence. This is the 17th century. And Bernini is continually saying in the course of his narrative, these things I am telling you would be incredible were it not that we have sworn testimony. And then he would present the sworn testimony. So this is not some medieval person who is piously blowing up tales and inventing. This is a period of history where there's an acutely growing awareness of the importance of evidence. And that's quite clear in the case of this particular narrative of Joseph's life, which is a later one. There were earlier. I mean, it's based on Bernini's biography draws upon Arcangelo Rosmi's eyewitness observations and Roberto Nuti's first biography of Joseph, who was a contemporary of Joseph and lived with him in the same context. So these people knew him, observed him, and were recording as his life as he lived it. And then, of course, there were all these letters of different people. There were many documents. And finally, it's the most valuable source of evidence are the sworn testimonies when it came to the actual canonization process. You had to get people who would vouch for the authenticity of the phenomena. And this was in a time when swearing meant a lot more than it probably does to people today. So I don't see any leeway for the skeptic here, unless you want to just doubt that any kind of historical documentation is valid. There's so much of it here, tons of it.
Well, I think for many people it would be axiomatic that, as David Hume wrote, that people who claim miracles are automatically either fools or liars.
Yes, and yet, and at the same time, Hume, in an essay, famous essay on miracles that he wrote, documents examples of miracles that are quite compelling. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular essay. Maybe you haven't read it for a while, but take a look at it. All of the stuff, I mean, Hume was honest enough to quote eyewitness persons who had seen some of the phenomena associated with what they called the convulsionaries. There was a whole bunch of groups that were doing things that are so bizarre and so weird, it's hard to accept as real. But there's overwhelming amounts of evidence for this stuff. And Hume had it all in front of him. And his only argument was, it's a priori impossible, this stuff. It's Nickel the same. The only difference between Nickel is nothing. He's a hack. Hume was a great intellect. But Hume put the data there in front of the reader to decide for himself or herself. Unlike Nickel, hasn't the slightest bit of intellectual honesty.
But even today, in the field of philosophy, there's the school known as naturalism, which suggests, and I've spoken to philosophers trained in this tradition, they believe that it's perfectly justifiable to dismiss the whole discipline of parapsychology out of hand, because it doesn't conform to their notion of what a natural world should be like.
Right. Well, it's an unfortunate state of be in. To me, it's anti-scientific, it's anti-intellectual, and anti-honest. Just for the sake of it does baffle me that anyone could hold that view. I can't understand it.
Well, at the same time, I suppose it's fair to say that the Catholic Church fathers who were evaluating Joseph of Copertino and eventually beatified him and canonized him had, at that point in time, been influenced by the writings of a person like Francis Bacon in England, who was considered the father of empiricism. And,
Right.
And Bacon himself was also deeply interested in esoteric culture and Hermeticism and, the possibilities that we now think of as parapsychological.
Absolutely. But there's an additional point. The Catholic Church has the benefit of this Roman legalistic tradition that everything has to be, there are laws, there are rules, and there's a thing called evidence, and you document things. So, whereas, let's say, I'm convinced that the levitation in the Tibetan tradition must have been just as wild, because all that artwork is there. But they didn't have a tradition of sanctification, canonization, and a legalistic obsession with documenting every phenomenon of importance. So we should be glad, I suppose, that the Church inherited that Romanistic or Roman tradition of legalism, because we've got evidence of some of this material that we would not have if we didn't have written eyewitness accounts of Joseph's flights. It would be a totally different story.
Now, in your book, you have a section that you call the parapsychology of religion. And I think this is very interesting because there are so many reports from within the various religious and spiritual traditions of events that would be of interest to parapsychologists, but parapsychologists, for the most part, don't dig into them the way you have. But if we were to apply parapsychological insights, it might give us a whole new perspective on the history of religions.
Well, that is a belief of mine, and I have written a few things to that effect, but I haven't written, and maybe this book that I've written in a sense is an illustration of it, but I absolutely agree that I'll just say flat out, offer you my view. I believe that with the help of parapsychology, the whole range of it, and including all consciousness studies, all of the scientific data that we have, it enables us to make sense out of a great deal that we would tend to automatically to dismiss as rationalists and materialists looking at the history of religion. So I'll just take a couple of very obvious things. We all know, parapsychologists who know something about, let's say, the role of belief. Gertrude Schmeidler coined the phrase, the sheep-goat effect. And the idea there is the more you believe in psi, the greater likelihood is that you will get a psi effects. And now, belief is a form of faith. It's one of the cornerstones of all the religious traditions, that there's something going on. There are things going on that we don't have immediate rationalistic, compelling reasons to accept. But if we open ourselves up and believe, but by the way, the word belief is not enough. I think when we believe, we're doing more than just having a sort of an abstract cognitive affirmation that something is possible. I think we have to look at the New Testament Greek word for belief, pistis, and that means trust, confidence. So my own suspicion is that the kind of belief that leads to transformations of behaviors are partly imaginative, partly psychoenergetic. They represent a whole disposition of the entire mind and body of a person. Not just a mere thing. Yeah, I believe in God. I believe in miracles. Sure. Now, let's have some coffee. It's got to be a total living belief. Mm-hmm. And parapsychology gives us clues and tells us that prayer, for example, which is a cornerstone of most religious systems, might work through various parapsychological phenomena, or in light of certain parapsychological phenomena that we know of. And I could go on giving examples. The healing phenomena. I mean, most of the great religions traffic in claims of unusual healing abilities. Well, we have lots of data, all kinds, some of it very trivial. It doesn't matter how trivial it is, because if it's the moment you've broken the ice and you're showing that mere intentionality can have physical effects on physical biological systems, we're in another ball game. We have something to learn, something to explore. And so we could use that data to revisit claims of religious miracles and religious healings. So yeah, I'm convinced that I even think that we can begin to make sense out of the concept of a transcendent deity in terms of the parapsychological and consciousness research that we modern folks have been doing. And I intend to write about that more as
well, I do know that you are one of the editors of a remarkable volume called Irreducible Mind that suggests that we're entering into a post-materialistic world, perhaps a world in which consciousness itself is fundamental. And from that philosophical perspective, it offers opportunities to reinterpret not only all of the natural sciences, but religion as well.
Well, I completely agree with you. And also when we think of the totality of so-called religion, and we can move on to the East, Eastern thinkers talk about consciousness being the divinity, and the gods being manifestations of consciousness, personifications of the root transcendent one consciousness. That Larry Dossey has written a marvelous book called The One Mind.
Yes,
just a wonderful book, just case after case of different area, different branches of human experience, aspects of human experience that suggest these the underlying transcendent potential of human experience. So yes, I'm convinced that in time, and I'm being, if we have time on this planet, I'm speaking optimistically now, that eventually science and spirituality, there's no reason why they ought not to come together in new and very unexpected ways. Mm-hmm. I think that science will have to renounce its dogmatism about the mind, and religion will have to renounce its dogmatisms when they are dogmatic, and say that only our religion, is the one that's going to provide the insight into salvation and enlightenment. I myself am more of a Hindu than any religion, and it happened one day. I walked on 71st Street, Manhattan, to the Vedanta Center, and I walked in and I saw on the wall written something that I've never forgotten. It said, "Truth." This was a quote from the Rig Veda. "Truth is one. People," well, actually it said men, but I'll say people call it variously. Very few words. Truth is one. People call it. That was it for me. That was enlightenment. I had it right there in the words of the Rig Veda, and I've never changed since then. That is my religious perspective, is right in that phrase. There's one consciousness, one ground of being, and beings, since time began, have been, depending on their culture, their language, their location, their geography, had found their own ways to try to connect with that root of consciousness. I know a book with that title.
Well, Michael Grosso, what a pleasure to have this discussion with you. It's very inspiring to think about the life of Saint Joseph of Copertino, and also to combine it with your own philosophical perspective. Thank you so much for being with me.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It was my pleasure.
And I look forward to future discussions with you as well.
Well, I do too.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org